All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our men's mental health panel for November of 2022. Tonight we have some really awesome panelists that are joining us. And so just to kind of introduce what's going to be going on tonight, Dexter and I, we're going to be moderating the conversation as we go throughout the night. And then
Ellie,
we'll be answering some awesome questions and helping us out. So first, if we just want to introduce ourselves, Dr. Stevens, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Dr. Hunter Stevens. I'm the COO and head of mental fitness at Mindful Athlete Training. Our mission is really to create a global community of people who are enthusiastic and engaged with mental fitness. And I look forward to sharing some insight and talking with you all today about how to take a more curious and more opportunistic stance and how you can kind of move past your perceived levels of limitation. So excited to talk today, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. That sounds great. Billy.
Can you all hear me? Beautiful. Hi, guys. My name is Billy Garton Jr. I'm the founder of the You Choose movement. I'm a former Division I and professional athlete. I played soccer at the University of Portland. And now my movement, the You Choose movement, we are on a mission to combat what I believe is an epidemic of loneliness amongst young men on college campuses. So I actually just got back on Saturday. We ran our first workshops at Princeton and Georgetown for a group of young men on both those schools. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm really grateful for the Hidden Opponent for putting on events like this to give myself and the rest of you the opportunity to connect and also dive deep into some topics that are not often brought to the table. So really grateful to be here and excited to bring to the surface and shed light on a little bit of my story and hopefully breathe life into you guys too.
That's awesome. We're super happy to have you. So thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us. And Hugh.
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Quentin Williams. I'm a retired two-sport Division I athlete, so I've been in your shoes about 10 years ago. And I got really passionate about men's mental health and just athlete mental health when I learned about the concussion problem that was plaguing a lot of athletes back in 2012 and still does today. And as I looked deeper and deeper, I started to realize that there was a correlation between athletes and men's ability to really connect with their emotions and their own mental wellness and the outcomes that the concussion crisis has. And so it's been my mission to help men and athletes connect to themselves, connect to their loved ones, and really connect to their purpose beyond sports. So I run a group program, several group programs. I love getting people together in environments like this to really talk about the tougher topics that we don't get to ask questions about very often. So happy to be a resource and really excited to dive in with the panelists here.
Good stuff. All right. Well, hi, I'm Dexter, by the way. If you have any questions during tonight's panel, just send them in the chat my direction. I'll collect them. We can do a Q&A session at the end. But otherwise, let's get right into this with the first question. For you guys specifically, let's start with Dr. Stevens. What is masculinity, and like what are the stereotypes between like masculinity and femininity, and then how do you balance that perception with like expectations?
Sure. So masculinity and femininity are really a framework of understanding. Traditionally it's thought about that, masculinity is a way to associate certain traits with males, and femininity is more a way to associate traits that are similar to or more common in females. And it's really allowing us to make a quick decision of, what's this makeup of this individual and how to better understand them. And it really becomes a belief system at the end of the day. And so, in the masculine sense, the traditional sense, it's, there tends to be strong, fearless, capable, resilient, sometimes brash. Where in the femininity, it's more the nurturing, it's humble, it's sensitivity, it's tolerant, or forgiving and caring. And I think there's value in both aspects, but sometimes they can be skewed on how they're worked and how they're pressed onto people in different ways. And so balancing that perception of masculinity, there tends to be sometimes a pressure of having to be one way, as well as femininity of having to be another. And I think it tends to be more in this fluid space where it doesn't matter your gender. It really is more so these traits that you possess and how you utilize them and the balance that you can engage with. And sometimes it's difficult to open ourselves up really to engaging with them because of the either our own personal beliefs or beliefs that are held by society that push us into one category or another, where it's more so on a spectrum more than anything.
Yeah, very well said. Billy or Q, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was beautifully put. I'm going to take a little bit of a more personal approach, and I'll speak into a little bit of how it relates to my story. For a long time, I didn't know that as a man I could have femininity in me. I thought as a man it meant I was just masculine and women were feminine. And to take both aspects of me, which has been my journey for the past few years, and understand how they play a role in my life has been the biggest piece of understanding what masculinity and femininity are. And I think Dr. Stevens spoke into the science behind it and the truth of the softness of the feminine and maybe a little bit more of the hardness of the masculine and the different traits that they can personify. But I think the stereotype that we find, and I think it all boils down to one word, and I found this in my story, which is the judgment of when I'm in one or the other. Am I being hyper masculine or am I being hyper feminine? And the judgment of who I can be in society, I think, is the biggest stereotype that we place, is when we can be one and when we can another. And what I know in relation to men and women is we tend to, as a society, want to place ourselves in a box as to every man can be only this way and every woman can be only this way. And if I was to speak for myself, I believe I have a lot of masculine traits in me, and I also believe I have a lot of feminine traits in me. And I shut those parts of myself off for a long time. And as I shut them off, I also shut off a deep piece of my happiness, a deep piece of my freedom, a deep piece of the playfulness that exists inside of me, and I believe exists inside of all of us. So I think the stereotype, the largest one, is just found in the judgment we place on how much of each we carry. And the healing piece of that is, as we continue to allow ourselves and give ourselves permission to tap into each side of them, we can actually free ourselves to be and to come, I call it coming home, to come home to who we really are. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and I want to double down on everything that's been said so far. I want to share a bit of a personal analogy that I like to use when it comes to masculinity and femininity. We've heard of the yin yang, right? We've heard of the masculine and the feminine as like a duality. Knowing that we do have, everyone on this call has masculine and feminine qualities. And in fact, we can't have anything in this world without masculine and feminine qualities. Everything you look at has that. Just, I use the analogy of a sandbox. The wood, the box that forms the sandbox, is the vision, the structure, the blueprint, the rigidity of the sandbox. The sand is the flow, the chaos, the beauty, the creativity. That's the sand, that's the feminine. The masculine is the box, and the feminine is the sand. And you wouldn't have much fun in a sandbox that had no box. That sand would turn into dust. You wouldn't have much fun in a sandbox with just a box. You would have no sand, nothing to play with. So I believe, every man, when it comes to their masculinity, for me, like in my experience, most men want to embrace both parts of themselves in any given moment and be able to flex their masculine self and their feminine self, depending on what the situation calls for. Depending if a loved one calls for me being a space holder and being that box, or if it calls for me being expressive and emotive and sharing my feminine parts of myself and creativity. So masculinity is very different than masculine feminine. I think masculinity is something we all find our own balance. We all find our own version of masculinity. It's why I lead a movement called Man Up Men's Group, because, you determine what manning up means to you, right? It means stepping up, stepping up into your authentic version of masculinity, which is going to be a different balance for everybody else in any given moment.
No, I think that's super important, kind of being able to, what all three of you have been mentioning with like, being able to give yourself permission in a sense to feel it, how you do feel and express yourself the way you can, and how important that is for men to be able, to do that, to feel like our authentic self. And especially with what you're mentioning, Q, at the end there, I know that comes with a lot of vulnerability. And to be your authentic self is such a vulnerable thing, because there's all the perception of what other people have to say and how they then will treat you. And so kind of wanted to shift gears a bit and look at how masculinity and being masculine kind of coincides with vulnerability. In particular, like, what are things that you can do yourself to, or how vulnerability impacts you yourself, and in both physical and emotional ways?
Yeah, I'll jump right into this. I've been talking about this a lot. You've probably heard, and folks, raise your hand if this resonates for you, but you've heard that like vulnerability is true leadership. We hear that a lot, but we don't actually know what that really looks like. Not many of our coaches or team captains lead with a lot of vulnerability. I don't know how it's like these days, right? But I know when I played, there wasn't a lot of like tears shed by the head coach. There wasn't a lot of vulnerability. However, I think vulnerability just kind of gets categorized as like tears and emotions. It's a lot more than that. It's actually more about leadership and sort of sticking your neck out there and being authentic, being yourself, showing your true colors. It's not just about looking sad, when you actually are sad, or feeling emotional when you are emotional. I think it's way more than that. And what's interesting about vulnerability is it's also the undercurrent and foundation for building relationships. Relationships are built on trust. And scientifically, you cannot build trust unless someone takes the first step to share a part of themselves. Again, not necessarily the emotions or the sadness, just a part of themselves, an authentic part of themselves. And when that is then reciprocated by the other person, then you start to build trust. I give you an inch, you give me an inch back, right? We kind of keep building on it, and it turns into 2 inches and 3 inches and 4 inches, right? And we start creating a friendship, right? And we create depth and understanding and trust. And if you want to talk about addressing loneliness for men, which is one of the core things around men's mental health that we should be discussing on this panel, is loneliness that men feel. It takes leadership to get out of loneliness and into relationship.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. I'm gonna add to that, because you ended that there, Hugh, with the topic of loneliness, which really has been my entire world, in the world that I work in, but also in my own journey, is my relationship to loneliness versus being alone. I realized about 3 years ago, I left college 5 years ago after a year and a half there. And I realized about 3 years ago that this entire time that I thought I was in need of so many different solutions, I was really just desperate to be seen. I was really just so desperate to be seen. And I know in relation to the world of men, we are all just so desperate to be seen. Yet at the same time, most of us are so afraid to share the parts of ourselves with others that we want them to see. When my identity was disappearing with my sport, I was afraid. I was lost. I was scared. I was alone. But what really lived at the forefront of that was I didn't want to tell anybody. I was so afraid if I owned what I was feeling, if I brought to the surface what existed, that with it, the identity that others had found me in, Billy the soccer player, that's all anybody ever knew me as for 19, 20 years of my life, Billy the soccer player. So if I own the fact that I don't know who I am anymore, that I'm afraid that this sport's slipping away from me, and with it, my confidence, with it, my self-worth, with it, my value to the world. If I own that, then what will people think of me? What will my friends think of me? What will my family think of me? What will my girlfriend think of me, who I believed was only with me because I'm a D1 athlete, what will all these people think of me who've only come to know me as an extremely talented athlete? And so I believe that vulnerability is one of the most courageous acts you can do, because you allow yourself to be fully seen. And that is one of the scariest acts in the world, is to open yourself up to the pain, is to open yourself up to the judgment, is to open yourself up to what exists when you choose to own what you're feeling. But I also believe that's what makes you alive. I also believe that that's what brings you to life, because there have been moments in the past 3 years in which vulnerability has brought to the surface a lot of my pain, and I've been met with unbelievable amounts of love and grace and support. And there have been other moments in which I've been met the opposite. And I believe that vulnerability is not defined in how others show up to us. It's the courage that we choose, which is in going first, which is everything that Q spoke to. We're waiting for others to see us. We're waiting for everybody else to see us, but they're just waiting for us to show ourselves to them. So I believe vulnerability, as Q said, that the larger core concept of this is that there's a desperation to be seen. And a mentor of mine said to me once, he said, Billy, leaders go first. And all of us on this call are either leaders or we're in the process of becoming a leader in some form or fashion. And so to be vulnerable is to go first. And that's what I believe.
That's powerful.
Yeah, and to jump off both your points, I think they're fantastic. I think vulnerability is this interesting trait because it requires the deepest level of openness within us all, right? An openness to look within and then to admit and to accept. And I think that's challenging at times because it leaves us in a state of potentially the what ifs, right? The fears that kind of exist. And so, on my entire role, our entire methodology is actually teaching people how they can lean into chaos. We actually love chaos because chaos is it's going to happen. It's not if, but when. And as athletes, as high performers, it's going to occur. And I talk with my athletes either when I'm working or building mental fitness with them in person or virtually, and I talk about confidence. And a lot of people believe and perceive that confidence is necessary, that you always are saying things are going to work out. But the most confident people in the world have doubt. But what they do with that doubt is they recognize that doubt and they trust in their ability to navigate whatever that obstacle is going to be, whatever that challenge is going to be. And what's required of that is to acknowledge both your strengths and areas of development. It's not weaknesses once you recognize it. It just becomes a new area to focus on, to grow from, to develop, to share, right? Whether that's communication and relationships, right? Whether that's openness to yourself, right? Whether that's, I like to make it analogous to, if you have a castle and you're the leader of that castle and there's a siege coming in, but you have, your flank is open and the back door is open, like you need to know that so you can send people there to strengthen it, but also to embrace it. So the vulnerability, but recognizing that vulnerability, to be open to your vulnerability will allow you to strengthen yourself as a whole, because no longer will you be afraid of that vulnerability. You can use that as a tool to grow and to learn, to explore, right? Explore the boundaries of what you're capable of. And typically your mind is going to set your limitation before anything else. So you're setting this limitation for what you're actually capable of before you even try it, which means you're not even going to have the opportunity to learn. So embracing your vulnerability is masculine because it allows us to embrace our challenges. It's going in head first and learning from it, and then exploring what that chaos is all about, which is empowering you because you're no longer afraid. You're embracing that vulnerability as a tool to develop and to learn from.
I think all those are really great points, like of how you take vulnerability and perceive it, and how it really is a very brave and courageous thing to be vulnerable and to kind of put your authentic self first. Whereas a lot of times, it may be stereotypical that, with the whole men don't cry, we don't show emotion outwardly, that actually by being able to say, that you might have doubt. Like there are those instances where not everything's going to be, great and fantastic, but having those moments where you can acknowledge that confidently, like that's really, I feel like that's very admirable, and something that when we fear the perception of others as a very, we worry about the possible negative outcomes that could come. I think that it almost flips it on its head and says, no, there's a lot of positive that can come from being vulnerable and being truly your authentic self in that regard.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the concept of the phrase "man up," and we hear that all the time. And how that and the difference between vulnerability and manning up and speaking up and how they're different. I think you guys really kind of nailed that on the head with how it is, something that is courageous and brave to do.
Yeah.
And it's not a weakness. If anyone wants to build off that.
I do. I think a lot of these topics that we're discussing today, guys, are like, if we were to take vulnerability, for example, I think it's not vulnerability itself, but the relationship we have with vulnerability that is shaping how we show up to the world. And all three of us, from what I'm hearing, are attempting to do is to redefine the relationship that everybody on this call has with vulnerability. All of us have come to this call and it's like we're wearing one lens, right? And that's the lens that is the voices of society, the voices of our family, the voices of whoever exists in our life that is repeated through word and action what it means to be vulnerable. And all we're doing is we're offering up a new lens over here, which you can take off the lens that you have on in this moment, and you can pick up this lens over here and you can choose to put it on. Because the truth is, a lot of the narratives that we have that exist up here aren't true. They're just true to us. And if we can rewrite how we've come to define vulnerability and courage, then we can rewrite how we show up in our lives. And so all we're attempting to do is take the topic and give a new lens to how you approach and perceive the topic so that you can show up in a different manner. And that's the same thing with man up. What man up has come to mean in our life is how we're choosing to show up. And so I think in this process of healing or self-growth or personal development, whatever you guys want to call it, that is on this call, that's all most of this is taking what you've come to know and recognizing that it might not be your voice, but the voice of people outside of you. And be open to a new lens that you can pick up and put on to change your perspective, and then from there change how you show up to the world.
Yeah, I have this running joke that we're all kind of delusional, and the reason why we all have a delusion to some degree is because it's that filtered lens that we see the world through, right? We're seeing the world through our own perspective, and if I was to hold up a card and on one side it was red and on my side it was blue, I would say it's blue, you would say it's red. And until I flip it over, you would never see that other perspective. But I am, by my belief, because of that filtered lens, my perspective, that's my life, that is my truth. And so the delusion, right, is to say that your internal belief system is constantly true, or that thought, that automatic thought that we have no control over, right? We don't get to choose if we stub our toe. Like, we're not saying, oh, this is great. We're saying this sucks, this hurts, right? We're feeling that in that moment. And it's automatic. We're not choosing that. But however, it's how we see this, a perception, and it's a choice. Once we build awareness, we have a thing called the triple A's. So it's awareness, acceptance, and then action. So the first thing is I need to be aware of my perception. I need to be aware of that automatic thought. I need to be aware of that situation. But then I need to accept, and acceptance doesn't mean complacency. Acceptance means I recognize that this is the consistent course. So many people get angry at themselves or mad. Why do I think this way? Why am I this way? That is how it is. And once we can learn to accept that, we can then start to recognize what action can I take, right? And by doing that, using the triple A's, you can use as a tool to shift that lens perspective, but then also to follow up that with action, which is going to make you feel like there's movement, which makes you feel and focus on the things you can control versus things that you can't.
Yeah.
I have so many directions I can go with this because there's so much to touch on, and I know we have more questions coming for the guys that are leading this. But something just came to mind. I think that you know, and maybe there's questions or specific comments you guys have about this, but I want you to think right now, for those that are on the call, what are some of the reasons or stories that you make up about vulnerability that would keep you from being vulnerable, especially if you're a man? But I think that a lot of the kind of emotional blockages that we have as athletes apply also to men and vice versa. We're kind of taught to stuff emotions and pain and all that stuff away to focus on the game. So what would have you not show up and be vulnerable and not be honest about your situation? I think one of the biggest things that athletes and men face is this sort of perfect persona, sort of like perfect record that we've always been a winner. We've always been incredibly effective on the field or in the pool. And I think to show up as vulnerable feels a little bit embarrassing, you know, for some people, because it's not, you know, what this persona or perspective has been, you know, up until this point, right? And, you know, I know as far as like transitioning out of sports, it can be really tricky to find your feet and find what you're good at and find what you find valuable about yourself outside of sports. It's so important to come back to center, right? And remind yourself that, you know, who I am is not what I do. I'm not defined by that. And when we can separate that from our identity and our worth, things get a lot easier, right? And so I think if you can bring it back, you know, as a man or as an athlete to authentically who you are at the core, everything you do is just an expression of that, right? And that is perfect, right? And from my perspective, that's perfect. Your results might not be perfect. They're not supposed to be, you know, even though a lot of coaches have told you, you got to be perfect at it, you know, step here, right? 90-degree angle, right? There's no such thing as perfection. That's been the biggest lesson I've really had to learn. And I really try to teach men and athletes to realize.
Yeah, it's not about the expectation of perfection, right? But it's about, you know, striving for growth that allows you to achieve that, right? Once you have that expectation, you know, you're talking about the shoulds. I should be this. I should have this much playing time. I should be executing here. But that focuses your sole identity on the outcome versus, again, what is that process? What are the things that are changeable? What are things that you can I be a little bit more deliberate in this next drill, on this next touch, on this next movement? Or, you know, am I taking it when I am moving on out of college or whatever my end of my sporting career looks like? You know, what are the values and the things that I can take away that I can still use in the next phase of my career as well, right? Those don't have to go away just because you're not in the sport anymore. It's I recognize the values that you can take from that.
Those are great points. I think that, I mean, what I'm hearing a lot of is this embracing of, you know, your authentic self, but also just the human aspect of life, and kind of taking it and saying, you know, like there are going to be moments where I'm doing better than others, but also like to be able to accept and act and move forward. That gives me a lot of mindfulness energy from there, which I think about, and how helpful that's been, and how helpful it is for so many people to kind of accept the situation you're in, but then, you know, find ways to move forward, and it lifts a weight, I guess, off your shoulders from perfection and all the pressure that we find ourselves putting, like we put on ourselves. I think that authenticity and acceptance of where we are and who we are is so important, like you guys have been mentioning, to, you know, being comfortable in our own skin. And kind of leads me to think, so we have, like, we've addressed what's personal and within us as far as how we can be vulnerable and how it, you know, impacts our perceived masculinity. But then how with others, how can we start to create those relationships that are built through our authenticity, like on like trust and honesty, and have those deeper relationships with others through these kind of newer trait, or not newer traits, but new perspectives on masculinity that we, some people may not have had before the call tonight.
Yeah. Choose to go first with the people you trust. That would be my answer. I would say choose to go first with the people you trust, because you'll realize that they're all waiting for somebody. That's what we're all waiting for. All of us on this call, if you could think about a relationship in your life that you wish could go a little bit deeper, I can almost guarantee you that they're waiting for you to go first, and you're waiting for them to go first. And we can just sit and keep waiting for each other and play this game of tug of war and keep our relationships at face value. Or we can choose to go first, because what I know is the depth of our relationships. If I was to think about my life, the depth of every relationship in my life has only changed, like everything in my life, when I've chosen to take responsibility for that change. If I want deeper relationships, I get to create deeper relationships. Because one thing you realize is that there are people in your life that just can't go there. And that's also a revealer to who gets to be in your life and who doesn't, in where you're going. There's a lot of people in my life. A mentor of mine said to me once, he said, Billy, when you commit to a journey like this, as an athlete, as a high performer, as an entrepreneur, as a high performer, you move through people faster than anything when you commit to this journey. Because a lot of people fall off the bandwagon because they can't meet you where you are. But the ones who do, you can create magic with. And so my suggestion would be start with the people you trust the most. It's like a muscle. When you go to the gym, you train a muscle. We're all well versed in being in the gym, right? You train a muscle. The more you train that muscle, the stronger it becomes. The same thing with courage and vulnerability. The more you train that muscle, the more, the stronger it becomes. And so I would say start with the lighter weights, which in this context, the lighter weights are those people you trust the most, right? And then eventually you get to a place where people just fall into your life, and that's the way you live. The way you live is at a depth that is beyond the surface, and people just manage to meet you there. But my suggestion would be begin with the people you trust the most.
That's amazing. I really think that's great. And it's kind of like not a revolutionary concept. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in doing this. You just have to, one person could be enough. And that step alone could be really huge for somebody. Love that.
Because you realize how freeing it is.
Yeah.
You realize how freeing it is when you go first with one person, and how deep that relationship can go. That becomes your permission slip to do it with everybody else.
I love that.
I'd like to build on that too, Billy. And I think that you create spaces for that, right? With men's groups across the country at different colleges. I create the same sort of environment for men to practice that. It's kind of like being in a gym. So you can go out and tackle the world, right? Like when you're done at the gym for a couple hours once a week with a group of guys. Sorry, where was I going with this? When you come back to, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Dr. Hunter, you want to take it away?
Yeah,
sorry,
no
problem.
We'll
I'll pick back up.
Yeah. And, I'm hearing this too, and I'm listening, and I think, starting with the people that you trust is critical. And a lot of times in relationships, they falter, they're challenged, especially through conflict. And, you heard me say, I like chaos a little bit. I like conflict a little bit too. And I think a lot of people don't. It's not that I'm looking for it. It's not that I'm seeking it out. It's just when it does come up, I think it presents an interesting opportunity. And we're talking about vulnerability. We're talking about masculinity. And I think how sometimes the masculine form might take on conflict, right? Tends to be brute, tends to be all in, tends to be, I'm right, you're wrong, I think a lot of times. And sometimes the element of femininity is more tolerant, right? A little bit more open-minded at times. But I think it's a blend of the both. And conflict, I think, is an opportunity to learn. And how we do that is we enter in through curiosity. I think when you try to enter in through any type of conflict with a coach, with a partner, with a teammate, the I'm right, you're wrong, even though one of you might be a little bit right and the other one may be a little bit more wrong, it's opening this dialogue of curiosity. Why is that person seeing it in that fashion? And I think sometimes because of our vulnerabilities, because of our feelings, right? Because it's ultimately what's going on deep down that's preventing us from opening ourselves up, right? Anger is a top level surface emotion. But normally there's a shame, right? Guilt, frustration, irritability, that's all building up underneath that tidal wave of anger, right? It's just showcasing as anger if we're yelling or we're within conflict. So when you can open in through conflict of more curiosity, where you're asking questions more so than you're maybe talking, and more so listening more, I think you'll get a lot more done. It doesn't mean that you'll always end up with agreement, but you'll definitely have a better understanding. So if this is a relationship with another teammate, that's going to help your teamwork, right? If this is with a coach, it's going to help you have better understanding. That coach have better understanding of you as well, but also with a partner, right? It's about building those relationships where you can better understand each other so you can start working forward compared to kind of always harping on maybe what is right, what is wrong, and you get stuck in the mud and then you tend to become adversarial versus each other. So in relationships, that does take vulnerability. It does take an openness to admit maybe my point of view is just my point of view. Doesn't mean that it's 100% accurate and true. And I think it's sometimes hard to do that. But if you can always enter in almost through the door of curiosity into any conversation, you're gonna open up a lot more conversations of openness, and you're gonna start to create a better understanding amongst the group.
Yeah, I love that we're talking about curiosity. We're talking about going first. And I'm coming back to my point. Thank you so much for kind of getting me back on track. It comes back to knowing. Wow, I'm like totally losing my train of thought again. We're talking about curiosity. We're talking about coming back to yourself and leading from that. Yeah, here we go. So what I love to start with is asking people, like, when it comes to a relationship or an opportunity, if you can start with what you want, asking yourself what you want. Want is it's an emotion, right? It's a desire. I'm not happy with where we're at and I want something more. So for instance, if you want to have a closer relationship with your roommate, if you want to have a better relationship with your coach, what would it feel like to share that with that person? That would feel pretty vulnerable, right? And like Dr. Stevens was just touching on, it can be really easy for guys to face conflict like that, like I want something more of you, Billy, or I want something more of you, Dr. Stevens. And for us to just go like, oh, I'm being wrong. That makes me a bad person. Like they want something from me that I'm not giving to them. I must be screwing up somehow. So it's a delicate topic, but I think if you can lead with what you want and acknowledge what is there and be grateful for it at the same time, you can open the door for like, oh, wow, I actually want that too. Yeah, I'm actually with you there. We share that desire and immediately you have a connection there. But I think sharing what you want is really vulnerable, right? I mean, think about falling in love, being the first one to say, I love you. That's pretty vulnerable. Like, I want to spend more time with you. I like you, There's other ways to express vulnerability. I think starting with what you want is a great place to start. Thanks for your patience with me on that.
That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of like the three of you are amazing. Oh my goodness. All of these great points you guys have been bringing up about, how to just start those conversations and how important and impactful they can be. I think that's been such a help to so many people on this call, because a lot of times it's just wondering, how do I start? Where do I go? And taking those steps to be the first person to talk, to say what you want. And those are all like great ways to get the ball rolling, because after that, I feel like from what you guys have been saying, it's amazing what results you can see and how much better quality of life a lot of people will have. Now, I know that that's not always the case and it's not always that easy. And so for when there are those, I guess, pitfalls where, we don't necessarily know how to start these conversations or or cope with our, our struggles as men with mental health. And when it's not going so well, what are, I guess, some unhealthy ways that, you'll commonly see that men get involved with to help cope with their negative experiences or poor mental health?
I'll start. I mean, we have so many examples, but I think this is one of them. Everyone has it on them. This is the classic new addiction that we all have. I sure have it, right? Whether I actually reach for it in the morning is a different story, but I feel the urge often. And, I know the difference between waking up and feeling the urge to do something like that, like scrolling through my email or finding something to either stress me out or hit a dopamine high, right? Like there's a reason why I reach for that. It gives me energy in some way. But I know the difference between that feeling of like wanting to go right to that, and waking up like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, like knowing that I'm on a mission and that I'm excited to go after what I'm about to do. Those are two very different feelings. And I think, you know it when you feel it. You know it when you wake up and you know what you're up to that day. You know when, something like this just takes up your free time, your distraction time. And at the core, we are all distracting ourselves or numbing ourselves from the emotional experience that we're actually feeling. Surprise, we're going to talk about emotions tonight, guys, right? Like the 5 core emotions I like to hone in on are joy, anger, sadness, fear, and shame. And I find it so often we're experiencing one or many or all of those at the same time. And you can experience a lot of those at the same time. And they're uncomfortable, including joy. If you guys don't know Brene Brown, there's an amazing talk she gives on how vulnerable it is to experience joy, because so many of us are afraid it's going to be taken from us, or it's not going to last very long, or we're going to be embarrassed when we're not happy tomorrow, right? So all these emotions are vulnerable to share and to experience in our bodies. And so, our natural instinct when we feel discomfort or we feel something that's kind of out of alignment with, what is normal for us, what our nervous system is used to, of course you're going to jump to something like this, And I think one of the biggest, mountains we all get to climb in this new day and age is really, putting a governor on how much we numb with things like this, things like alcohol, things like sex even, Everyone has things, right? There's a lot more that I'm sure the other guys want to share, but I think it all comes down to like we're all numbing or trying to avoid an uncomfortable or unusual emotion. When really, if we actually just sat with it, we would actually find way more information. We'd be able to live way more smoothly. It might be uncomfortable for a little while, but like most things, it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I'll go off of that. I agree. I think the phone is definitely one of those tools and mechanisms that draw our attention and bring us in and absorb us in a fantastical world that is enjoying, that is releasing dopamine, that's exciting, but it's not always necessarily going to be supportive of us. And we talk about these helpful, thinking about our mental in a different way, and I think. I might take this in a different route, but it's more so. I think it could be an unpopular opinion, but I think an unhealthy coping mechanism that a lot of people use is retreat. It's when I'm struggling or I'm going through something difficult or challenging, I'm looking for the best way to pull myself out of that. Now, that doesn't mean that isn't required, but what happens when you start to retreat, you start to pull yourself out of challenge, difficulty, isolating yourself, right? It starts to amplify the very thing that you're trying to avoid. Because as I mentioned earlier with chaos, it's not if, but when it will show itself again. It's not if, but when you have to go back to that team, you have to go face that class, you have to go face yourself. Whatever it might be, it's going to come up again. And when you start to look for a retreat, when I look to try to remove myself from it, it's automatically amplifying that aspect as negative. You're labeling it as negative, and your nervous system as well as your mental and emotional thoughts will start to automatically associate when that discomfort, when that uncomfortable thought, that feeling or experience comes up, it will automatically be associated with negative. So it becomes this self-feeding cycle of it gets bigger and bigger. I like to say we need to face the monster. What I mean by that is like there's a shadow in my closet and I don't want to look at it. And so my imagination is running it. It's making it worse and worse and worse. It's feeding that narrative. All I have to do is stand up and turn on the light once and recognize, okay, it's just a puffy coat, right? It's not what I thought it was going to be. But with stress, right, with being vulnerable, right, with failure, we try to run away from this so often, but it's amplifying the very thing. So my challenge, my coping mechanism that I would really encourage you to do is learn how to find ways to kind of take risks with support, right? It's kind of like how you build a muscle. You put stress under it with proper recovery. You're doing it with intent. You're going in, I'm going to stress myself out. I'm going to put pressure on myself, my muscles, my endurance to build stamina, to build strength. To do that, as Billy said, you're doing that as well with your mental. It's a muscle. It's something that can be built. We're leveraging neuroplasticity by leaning into it. So good coping mechanism is to lean into those things and recognize the supports that you can use, not to isolate yourself, not to look to retreat, because that is an unhealthy coping mechanism. And then you tend to fall into, maladaptive behaviors or maladaptive thinking patterns or maladaptive, techniques to support yourself during that.
Beautifully put. I want to tell a story about my own personal journey. But before I do, I want to touch on that, Dr. Stevens, what you shared. I've come to believe that anything that you keep in the dark holds power over you until you choose to pierce the light. The moment you allow what exists in the dark, the moment you peel back the curtain and the light touches it, it immediately loses its power. Immediately loses its power. I believe that in a lot of these, we're talking about unhealthy coping mechanisms. I believe that a lot of these unhealthy coping mechanisms, a lot of them, it is not the thing that we're doing, it is why we're doing it. It is the narrative of the thing as to why we're doing it that creates an unhealthy coping mechanism. I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, I was 4'11". I had cystic acne all over my face, neck, chest, and back. I was an awkward, socially awkward, anxious kid, right? So soccer, my sport, was my safe haven. So I plugged my entire identity, my belonging, my entire being into the sport. My pain was turned into passion for 2 hours a day because it was the only place in the world I knew I belonged. When I got to college for my freshman year, I'd been promised the world by my coach at the University of Portland. And then at first I got injured and then got told I was going to redshirt. That was like nothing I'd ever heard of. I'm like Billy, the star athlete, #1, build the team around me. And here I am sitting, not only riding the bench, I'm now watching my team from the stands because my coach doesn't see the value in me. And the moment that I got told I was going to redshirt, everything from the past 10, 12 years of my life that I'd stuffed under here resurfaced. The pain of being not feeling like a good looking kid when it came to women. The pain of feeling like I had no friends. I was the kid in high school who I was friends with everybody, but at the same time friends with nobody. Because all I felt that people needed me for was I had an English accent, was to say words like garage and turtle and things that made them feel like it was very face value, a lot of the friendships. And so all the pain resurfaced. And in that moment, I had two options. One was to face the pain that had surfaced, which I never had to face because I always had soccer. And the other was to run. But this time I couldn't run in a healthy way by plugging it into soccer because I didn't have that outlet. And so what I chose to do was I ran. And by running, what I did was I hid behind alcohol. In a cultural, in a college environment is necessarily bad at face value, right? It's a lot of people use it for enjoyment and fun. And I think there's doses of that aren't massively unhealthy, right? But I was drinking because there was a man that came out when I had alcohol in my system that didn't exist while sober. That was why I was drinking. And I didn't realize that until after I left school. A mentor of mine said to me once, he said, Billy, an addiction is anything that has more control over you than you have over it. And anytime I'd step into a social environment, I had to get absolutely obliterated drunk because I didn't know who I was without alcohol in my system. I was so scared to be myself and to free myself. So I hid behind alcohol. I hid behind a girlfriend. The first day of school, I met a girl. And the moment I got told that I was redshirting, sure enough, 2 weeks later, I was dating the girl. And we ended up dating for 4 years. And it's not the girlfriend that was an unhealthy coping mechanism. It was that I was distracting myself from loneliness. I knew after 2 years that I didn't want to be in the relationship, but I was so scared of being alone that I stayed in that because I'd never received the typical validation from women that I'd always wanted. So there was a deep belief inside of me that I would never get that again. So I hid behind her. Pornography is a big one that men hide behind often. So those were 3 coping mechanisms that I chose to hide behind because I was too afraid to face what was so present, which was soccer got taken away from me, and with it, my entire worth to the world. And the work for me over the past 3 years has been understanding where those narratives have come from about me not being enough, me not being good looking enough, me not being fun enough to invite people into my life, for people to want to be around me not being anything to the world outside of my sport. That's the work. And for many of us on this call now, there's going to come a point in the not so distant future where you won't have the sport anymore. And it's a chance to look at the narratives that you've found yourself, that you've created in your life outside of the sport. And what do you go to when you don't have that sport to plug into? So the work is painful in moments. The work is revealing. The work is incredibly vulnerable. But like choosing to go first in vulnerability in a relationship, it's also the most freeing experience of your life because you bring back parts of yourself that you've realized have been lies the whole time. They were lies that were ingrained in you from high school and elementary school and as a child. And often those lies play a role in our life until we choose to look at them, shed light on them, and then do the work to recover those parts of ourselves. So I hope that lands.
Yeah, that was incredible. Excuse me, very, very good story. I feel like something that, like you said at the end there, all of us are gonna relate to at some point. I know for me, it's in the not so distant future, being a senior. And so I feel like I'm starting to build up those strategies now and recognize those things now. So I don't hit a wall come May, come June, where I'm really struggling with that. So I think we're going to move on to a couple questions here for you guys, just to wrap this up. So one that we got was, how would you advise like people of these chapters of the Campus Captains, part of the hidden opponent community, to engage more male athletes at their schools, to participate in the events, and to begin conversations about the mental health as a whole?
Yeah, so I'll just jump on that. So, at my full athlete training, like our entire mission is to create that global community of people who are enthusiastic and engaged in mental fitness. And one of the aspects that I talk about a lot of times is mental health right now, especially for athletes, is kind of like a Prius. And what I mean by that is it has 4 wheels, it has an engine, it's going to be reliable, it's going to get you from point A to point B. This is a bad example right now because Elon Musk, but the Tesla, what he did was he made it sexy. He made electric cars sexy. People desired it. People wanted to get after it, right? So what we need to do is we need to open up the dialogue, but we also need to make your mental a little bit sexier. We need to make sure that people are engaging with it in fun activities. People can engage with it in a fitness style lifestyle. People just are infusing it within their life that makes it fun and vibrant, just a natural part, just like you do your physical, and make it fun and it becomes a lifestyle. that we can live. So I think when you can make it sexy, when you can make it fun, when you can make it engaging, especially as an athlete, as former athletes, it's going to make it more a proactive approach versus a reactive approach. Because right now it's wait until something's broken and then I'm going to go fix it. It's no, I'm going to actively just be talking about this just as it's everyday thing. I'm going to actively be working on it because it's something that I build, because I know that my mental is just as important as my physical, but I need to be actively engaging with it. So I think that's a critical piece. And if they want to learn more, they can always visit our website.
Yeah, I love that, Dr. Stevens. I want to check out your work too, to learn more about it. I want to double down on that because I think that in my work, when I work with current athletes through a program called Beyond Sports, we focus on how the way that we show up in one area of our life often is the way that we show up in most others. And so when I can address something in my life beyond sports, all the athletes are so amazed by how it shows up on the field for them, how it shows up in the classroom for them. When you do shine light on those parts of your life that you haven't addressed, there's so much possible. And so this is not about where men are broken. Never use that word. Never use that word. Never tell a man that he's broken or that he's not doing enough, right? Men are hurting, but more importantly, men are not reaching their full potential. And we as athletes, I don't know if you guys know the stat, but I think 95% of Fortune 500 CEOs were once athletes. So we have the opportunity to literally impact those that are going to make the biggest and most important decisions, the Elon Musks of our world. If we can impact their hearts, we are making a huge impact on the world and changing the trajectory of our world. So come back to how a man can find results, like more potential, more opportunities, optimize, be a better performer, all the things that Dr. Stevens was talking about, right? Like results oriented, not focusing on the gap right now that you're witnessing maybe in a man's life. Focus on the potential you see in those men's life. So when it comes to your campus, like talk about how, there's a story, take Billy's story, for example, like how, addressing those wounds from high school allowed him to start his business and get his mission out to all these colleges, right? And show up more powerfully. Billy didn't have an unsuccessful life before, right? Like he's now just like leapfrog because he's addressed those things.
Yeah, I'll jump on top of that. And what I'll say is the reason I share stories so often, guys, is because I've learned that the topic mental health doesn't resonate at face value for a lot of men. But when you can use different language for a man to be able to say, me too, you can bring them into environments for further healing. I think it's less about, I think the most challenging part, and this is what I found in my work too, is getting men into the room. And so what I would say is shift the language you're choosing to use and try and either tell stories or utilize language that might pertain to a man so we can read something and say, I want to be there for that. I'll give you an example. And I believe that it has been one of our largest challenges too within the You Choose movement in getting men in the room. But we ran a workshop on Thursday last week for 20 guys at Princeton. 11 guys in the room were athletes, okay? We do a check-in at the beginning of the workshop, and the check-in involves you say your name, your grade, year, and why you chose to show up today. 10 out of the 11 athletes said that they chose at the beginning of the workshop, said that they chose to show up because they were supporting a friend. That was their reason for choosing to show up, okay? We then proceeded to do a 2-hour workshop, and at the end, we hand every guy a card, and the card says, I chose to be here today because. Not a single answer on that card by the end was because I'm supporting a friend. Every single guy said, because I don't want to be alone anymore, because I don't know how to build deep relationships in my life, because my girlfriend just broke up with me. One guy said, because my coaches were recording a voice memo talking about me because they wanted to keep it for themselves, and they accidentally texted the voice memo to me, and I am distraught. So what I believe is the biggest challenge is to get the guys in the room. So if you can shift the language to get them in the room, Once you get them in the room, the topic, the room, the theme takes care of itself. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to know they are loved. And most guys, I would say more so than women, need to be pushed a little bit. When you put them in front of each other, they recognize how freeing, how fulfilling, and how beautiful these spaces can be. But we just need to push the room a little bit. And you can do that in your language, you can do that in storytelling, and you can also do that by one of the things that we're trying to do within the movement next year is mandate. We're running 8-week programs. So we're working with the athletic department at Georgetown and the athletic department at Princeton to mandate the first session. So if we have a container of 30 guys, the first session is mandatory. They must show up. Then beyond that, they can choose if they want to be there or not. So there's options for those methods of approach as well within the athletic departments at your school, within the coaches that you know will listen to that message. And then the final one I'll say is most people don't even know the truth of what's going on in these spaces. And just speaking into the stats can support people in understanding how prevalent this is. 88% of college suicides are committed by men. Over 50% of men in college say they feel deeply alone. 1 in 5 men say in college they don't have a single person to talk to. Just speaking into those things from a faculty and staff perspective creates movement because they now have an obligation in many ways to spark change.
Yeah, I mean that's something that the hidden opponent does a good job, as well as the resources in these guys here too, right? Is what you're talking about is advocating. You're talking about creating these open spaces. We work with an NFL agency, and I interviewed 20 NFL athletes, and I said, how important is your mental? And all of them said it's vital. And I said, well, how often are you training it? And I think 2 of them said I'm doing meditation and yoga. And so these are people at the elite levels, right, who aren't taking care of themselves, but a lot of them don't even know where to start. And, we can talk about changing the language because I think that's critical because it opens the door for people to start. But, people like Billy, people like Q, people like the hidden opponent, people like us, we're opening the door and giving more resources for people. And I think as that continues to grow, I think we'll see more and more men fall into that and see that this is a resource to actually strengthen them, not to make them weaker. And I think that's kind of flipping the script a little bit.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. I got one more question, kind of a 2-parter, and then we can wrap it up here. But so far, I think this has been a wonderful talk. Glad that you all could join us here on Monday night. So the last one, we'll just go around. If you guys could list a book or a talk about men's mental health that you guys have found impactful for yourself, or something that you recommend for us to listen to afterwards. And then where we can find you, either on social media, email, if some of these guys have more questions or want to get connected with the rest of you.
Man, don't make me pick one resource. That is really tough. You're talking to students of this stuff that have been reading stuff for 5-10 years. Whew. One of my favorite resources, if you all are on social media, I obviously post a lot of videos that talk about all the tools that we're talking about today and more. And I know Billy does that as well. One of my favorite people out there for men's mental wellness is Dr. Jason Wilson. Sorry, he's not a doctor. I don't believe he's a doctor. Mr. Jason Wilson, he's based in Detroit. He runs something called the Cave of Abdullah in inner city Detroit, and he helps young boys in the inner city, embody and practice strong masculinity in the form of martial arts. And he just cuts right to the core, right to the heart of the matter. And his stuff is really, really inspirational. He's a lot of great tools. I've not read his books, but I would bet that they're incredible. Yeah.
All right, I'll cheat then, Q, because I'll do 2. So the first book that I really like, it's not necessarily specifically just for mental, but it's The Obstacle is the Way. You may have heard of the Daily Stoic, right? Ryan Holiday. But he writes a great book about the Daily Stoic. It takes lessons learned from Marcus Aurelius back in the day. And it really showcases how, you know, the challenges in our lives, again, we sometimes leverage them and identify them as the problem. Where, you know, this entire book tells great stories of how people use those obstacles as the fundamental building blocks for them to grow or to overcome their problems, and how they leverage them. And they're really interesting. There's some sports psychology in there as well, which is fantastic. So that's The Obstacle is the Way. The second one I really like is, it's called The Book of the Five Rings. It's actually by a samurai, you know, from the 16th century. He was in over like 37 one-on-one individual battles, and at the end of his life, he wrote this book. It talks about sword techniques, which are really interesting in terms of how we think about it, but a lot of the foundations there are kind of about letting go of certain thoughts, how we judge ourselves, how we view opponents, meaning if we identify an opponent as better than us, we typically have lost before we've started. So it really talks about those techniques, as well as how we can change and shift our rhythm. But there's a lot of really great insights in that book. The way that you can get in contact with me, it's Dr. Hunter Stevens on Instagram, or again, you can go through any of our social channels at mindfulathletetraining.com.
If we're going with 2 books, then I'm going to go with 2 as well. Thank you for opening up the opportunity to do so, Dr. Stevens, because I have 2 in mind that came straight to my mind. I see these as crucial readings for any young athlete, and really any young man or woman. The first one is called Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown. You mentioned Brené Brown earlier. I remember when I was leaving soccer, the biggest conversation I was navigating was surrounding loneliness, and how I could recognize and learn who I am in the world outside of my sport. And Braving the Wilderness is a phenomenal read on what it means to, she calls it brave the wilderness, what it means to leave the zone of comfort, to leave. I remember for a long time what I was doing was I would put myself in environments of people that I didn't even want to be around, just to say that I wasn't alone. And that's what keeps us the most lonely. And the wilderness is the gap in which you leave the people you once knew, which we often do when we're sportsmen and athletes, and you're finding your new community. And what exists in the gap is the wilderness. And what exists in the gap is the forest. And when you step into the forest, there's nobody there. And you have to walk for a little bit to find your community and find your tribe. And so Braving the Wilderness is a phenomenal read. And one that I think every person in the entire world should read, I read it once a year, is The Alchemist. It's a story of a young man named Santiago. I think a lot of us have read it at some point. The first time I read it was in school, but I never really took insight into what the journey was about and what it was speaking into. But I think we can all find ourselves in Santiago's story and his journey. And so those would be my 2 resources, 2 phenomenal books that I come back to often in my life. And I suppose another resource I'm going to throw it out there as a slight plug is the You Choose movement. That's our entire world, and our work at the moment is collaborating with different colleges to put and bring men's groups that create healing on campuses across the country. So you can find me on Instagram at Billy Garton Jr. That's where I post and share most of my content. If you're more interested in the movement and what we can do in that regard. I know I've been speaking a little bit to the hidden opponent at a higher level as to how that looks, but it's just billygartonjr.com. The youchoosemovement.com page is up and being refurbished at this current moment, but you can find me personally at billygartonjr.com.
All right. Awesome.
I just want to throw one more shameless plug on it. So I host a podcast too. It's called the Head Game Podcast. What we do is we interview high performers, and they kind of talk about the head game that they play in different areas. So last week we released a podcast with the first ever female NFL agent. She's now actually a teacher at Georgetown in law about sports management, which is really cool. This week we're releasing, actually tomorrow we'll be releasing, his name's Oliver Parsons. He founded Air Force Gaming. He dealt with a lot of mental health challenges in the Air Force and found a way to connect his community through esports and gaming. And now there's only over 15,000 airmen and women who are part of the organization and group efforts. So we'll be releasing them all throughout the holiday season and hopefully and beyond. So you can check out the Head Game podcast as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's all we got for you guys. Thank you so much. This was an awesome panel. If you have some more questions, we're going to stick around for a little bit after if you wanted more personalized questions, but that's all we got for you. So thanks for joining us.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for hosting. This is awesome.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it greatly. Super cool.
Oh, lots of good stuff. I'm going to have to like rewatch that recording and internalize it more.
Will you guys be sharing it? Will you guys be sending it over? Can you send it this way?
Yeah, we can get it to you guys for sure, for sure.
I love that. Yeah.
I feel like there's such great insight on this call. Just like 3 great perspectives, and then, you know, bringing up so many topics that a lot of men just don't talk about. I think it's awesome to have all 3 of you guys here, to just be so open and honest with us. That it's so helpful. And I feel like everyone on the call would agree.
I'm so happy for the space, guys. I wish I could stay a little bit longer, but I need to run to a call that starts in a couple minutes.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, please reach out if I can be of more support. Great to meet you, Dr.
Great connecting with you.
Dr.
Yeah.
Stevens. Yeah, we'll connect more.
Absolutely.
Cheers, guys. Have a great night.
Have a nice night.
Thank you. I actually have to jump as well, guys. I'm running late for another event, but I appreciate you both greatly for hosting this. This was super fun. I'm excited for more conversations. Dr. Stevens, I love your insight, my friend. I would love to connect with you as well. Maybe I'll shoot you a DM on Instagram and we connect in that regard.
Sounds great, man. Great meeting you.